All right, Tim, we are recording the answer to your questions that I have in front of me regarding equipment rental invoicing. And one of the questions was show how we invoice a company for company owned assets, equipment using the rental lease feature in Total Office Manager. So I'm going to cover that. Let me clear my screen here. The first thing we want to do is go to the asset manager. This is a list of all of our company's assets, including, but not limited to, anything that we might want to rent, lease, or loan out to a customer. And I'm going to create a new one. And I think what I'll create is a chiller. So we can fill out quite a bit of information here. I'm going to skip several things, but you wouldn't want to when you're setting it up. And we'll let's see here. Trying to decide what information I want to put in here. Add new. I'll put in manufacturer. And asset type. Now this asset type list here is from the Internal Revenue Service. Some people will ask us if they can edit these. They can't. And that's because it is for income tax reporting purposes. So if you don't quite see what you're looking for in here, just keep in mind that's the IRS for you. If they don't give it to you, then you don't really have to worry about picking the wrong thing. I'll call it, say, other, but that's why you can't modify the asset type. Now you have an option of putting in a location. We could assign it to an employee, a vehicle. We could assign it to a customer. We're not going to do that at the moment. We can assign it to a warehouse. We can pick a department that it belongs to. Commercial HVAC, for example, design, build, demand service, whatever you think is appropriate. So I will just pick commercial HVAC. The next step is we could add an image if we wanted to. So I will do that. I have a chiller in here somewhere. Oh, maybe I don't. All right. Well, I'm not gonna pick one then. Okay. So the next step is to go ahead and click OK to save. I should mention, as long as I'm in here, we could establish a depreciation schedule for this item. And then we have additional information, such as user-defined fields. And then we would normally also add document links. So we would drag and drop documents related to this, schematic diagrams, technical diagrams, sales literature, or whatever we wanted to. But normally we would do a lot more than we've done here. I'm just going to click OK. And now we have that chiller on that list. Now we want to go to our invoice items list and create an item for renting things or leasing things. And I think I have one in here. I'll search for it. Rent. Let's see. I'll type in the word lease. And there's lease. So I have lease monthly. You don't really need to have multiple lease items in here unless you wanted to. So in other words, if you have 100 things that you lease out to people, you don't have to have 100 items in here unless you thought it would be a good idea for your company. And how would you know? Well, after you've used the software a while, you just know those things, but you might say to yourself, do I want item history for this specific chiller? And the item history feature, if you haven't seen it, is this, and it shows you all the activity throughout the software for this lease item. And it may be good enough to go in here and see all the different chillers that you lease. And you might even decide to go, say, halfway, where you modify the lease item and you say lease monthly chiller. So you could at least have history on all the chillers that you're leasing. All right, we can always change that description on the invoice later. You don't have to put a price in here. You can always change it later. And that's what we're going to do next. So step 1, add the asset. Step 2, make sure that you have an item used for leasing. Now we can go ahead and create an invoice. And we will pick C&A Foods. They have past due invoices. That's all right. We'll give them a break on that. Now I go find the lease item. And here it is. Monthly lease on a chiller. And then I could type in something else. Like, for example, the model number. And I'll decide on the price per month. And maybe we'll call that $250 per month. Okay, so now we have an invoice for $250 per month. Now, certainly we would take a little more time to fill in the details of the invoice. We would want, for example, to put in detailed notes about the lease. We might attach documents. We might have terms and conditions. So I didn't forget that. It's just we're not going to do that right now. The next step is we need to pick the item that we're leasing. And we will find that in this list. And actually, we won't. I made a mistake. I'm going to save my work. I'm going to go to lists, or pardon me, go to company, go down to the asset list, and we're going to open up that chiller. And modify it. What did I forget? The additional info tab. This is available to be leased or rented. That's what I forgot to do. All right. So if I save the invoice, it basically refreshes it. Now I will go to the lease, which you can drag over to the left if you do this a lot. I don't lease too many things, so it doesn't matter to me. I'm going to have to close that invoice and open it back up. Refresh that list. Okay. Now we'll do it. All right, there it is. So what we're doing now is we are associating this company's asset with this line item for leasing. And you might ask yourself, well, what do the financials look like? Where will the income go? Because when we created the asset, we didn't really deal with the income account, the cost of goods sold account, depreciation expenses. We didn't deal with any of that. That will come from, the income will come from the lease item. So when you create a lease item, and this would be another reason to create many, you will establish the income account that will be affected. So when you lease this, you're going to see income on your income statement. Where? Where will you see it? You'll see it on the GL account, the chart of account that you pick when you set up the lease item. Now, for extra credit, you can change that on a line item basis. And this is one of the reasons why we allow that. I go down to Form Preferences. I can put the income account, put all three of them on there. I can put those on this line item. So now, if I wanted to change the income account, which is by default parts and materials, I could actually change it to another income account. And I don't have one set up for leasing, but I easily could. In fact, why don't we do that just to be thorough? Add new, type of account, what kind, income, leases. And I can get as detailed as I want. I could have a parent called lease and 10 different types of income underneath it if I wanted to. So now that income is going to go to a new line item on our income statement called lease. And at this point, the only thing left to do is email it or print it and get paid. So I will click Save, and that's done. Now the next step, email it, print it, do whatever we want to do. Now, one of the questions that I was asked, Tim, by you is, what about a monthly lease? Because this is just one. Well, we could make copies of this. We could go down here and create a copy of it and make copies if we wanted to. But chances are what we really want to do is memorize it. And what memorizing does is recreates it. So we'll give it a name, Invoice for Chiller Lease. And we can decide if we want the software to remind us or just automatically do it, just automatically create it. Well, when do you want to start? Well, I'm going to start the next one on the 1st of July. And how often do you want to create it? I want to create it every month. And when do you want it to end? I can't say never end. I have to pick a date. But it can be a date long in the future. So we'll just pick the date randomly. Now, when you generate this invoice, what if it happens to fall on a weekend? Do you care? Or do you want it to be the next business day? Next business day. And what employee is going to be the one that creates this transaction? So in other words, the transaction is going to get created, but somebody's name is going to be attached to this. And I'll decide it's going to be Ashley. And I'll go ahead and give her the reminders and click OK. And that's done. So now every month, this invoice will be regenerated. And how do we bill them? Well, you could email it. You could print it. You can email them in batches. You could print it and mail it. You could just assume they're going to pay you. Maybe they are paying you with a credit card. And then you can use our credit card processing to charge their credit card for the monthly lease. And that can also be done in a batch manner. You can batch that process up, so you're not doing those one at a time. Now, another question is show how we would apply a portion of the depreciation cost to the invoice. You really can't do that easily. We don't have a feature built in to allow you to allocate an expense item on your GL, on your income statement, to an invoice. So we don't really have a way of magically getting an expense on the invoice. About the only way to get, or I should say it like this, the normal way to get expenses and costs of goods sold on an invoice is through the accounts payable system, where you're buying inventory and you're selling inventory and you're entering timesheets and you're paying people. So the normal course of your activity is building costs of goods sold and possibly even expenses into an invoice. But every month, if you're depreciating assets, there isn't a way to get that depreciation portioned out to a specific invoice. You could, however, move some of that money with an adjusting journal entry. You could move some of that money to the customer or to a job that you set up. So if it was really important to do that, what you could do is you could create a job under that customer. So here are ZNA Foods again. I could add a job. We'll do that. Called Chiller Lease. And I might have a contract number in here, something like that. And so now we've created a job. And so what do we do with that job? Well, we can now change this invoice to the job. And it's asking, are you sure? It thought that was kind of odd, and it probably is unusual. Now we can make an adjusting journal entry, and we can pick our depreciation account, and we can pick a COGS account or an expense account, and then we can pick the job that it applies to. And where is that job? There it is. So I won't go through that whole process, but you could go ahead and create your adjusting journal entry to move that money, and then you can memorize the adjusting journal entry just like you memorize the invoice, so that it moves that money every month for you. The key, though, is we have to move the money. We can't create it from scratch because the way accounting works, right? So we move it from our company's depreciation to cost of goods sold or to expense overhead. One side note, by the way, to that is, and it's none of my business really because it's not our software, but just remember, if you're out there doing that, if you're watching this video and you do that, you're going to want to keep track of those depreciation adjustments, because your accounting people, when they prepare your taxes, they need to know about that activity. So if you're moving money out of depreciation and putting it into COGS or overhead, they need to know about that. So far, do you have any questions on that, Tim?
No, there was a section on the invoice, those tabs up there. There was one that says asset on my database, but it seemed like that wasn't important when you did it. What was that about?
Each of your items, let's take a look at an item real quick.
Yeah,
When we
wasted.
yeah, when we create an inventory item, it wants to know what's the income account, the COGS account, or the asset account, which is inventory on your balance sheet. And you have the ability to change that on a line item basis. Now, this is a lease item, so it does not have an asset account selection, and that's why it's inactivated. But that's what that is. The key is you're picking the lease item. You're making sure that you have that column on your invoice and you pick that lease item. So you're associating the lease with that chiller. And then, by the way, if you were to go back to your asset list, and I have it already open, don't I? There it is. If we open that, we can go anytime we want to. We're here looking at it. We can go into the history of that asset. In fact, we don't even have to open it. We can go into that item's history and we can see who currently has it. So this shows that it's appeared, this asset, this chiller has appeared on one sale. And we have the details there. We know the customer that has it. And we can edit that. So we can go right into the invoice to look at it for details. We can go to our assignments tab and we would see the history of who it's been assigned to. Now, it's been assigned to two different entities, Z&A Foods, but then we came back and we reassigned it to a job we created. Every person that it gets assigned to, whether it's a chiller, by the way, or a tool, because that assigned to could be an employee or a vehicle. The asset history shows us everything that's ever happened to that asset.
Does it show us when that lease is over? I know we selected a time, an end time. Is that on there as well?
Not here. You're talking about the memorized transaction. And the
No.
memorized,
When we created it and we selected it as a rental, we had to enter date as far as when the rental agreement ends.
are you
Because we
saying
cannot just
are you
we
saying that
cannot
we did do that?
we did. We selected a date. It gave us an
Right.
option to select a date.
And that was in the memorized transaction form.
Okay, yeah, you're right.
Of course I'm right. Isn't that that's just a given.
Yeah.
No, I'm kidding you. But yeah, that's where you saw that. We memorized it. And so, if the lease is in perpetuity, it never ends, then we just have to pick a date in the future, far in the future. But normally it does end 3 years into the future, whatever. That's the end date. The software is going to create that invoice for us automatically every month. And like I said earlier, it would also do the same thing for the adjusting journal entry. If we wanted to move money into cost of goods sold, then we would start putting costs of goods sold into this job. We call it a job, but we would actually move money from depreciation into cost of goods sold if that's where we wanted it. And it would be found under this job in a job costing report. That way you could go run a standard job costing report and you would be able to see the profitability of this lease. That's the advantage, Tim, of making it into a so-called job rather than have all that money just mixed up with a single entity. Once the lease is over, you can then inactivate the job and it will not show up on the list anymore unless you wanted to see it. Does that make sense?
Makes sense.
Yeah. So let's take a look real quick because that I can see that question coming up. Well, what's that report look like? There's a lot of reports. I'll just pick one randomly. We'll say all, and the customer will go down to pick the job. Preview. Now, normally we'd have a lot more info on here, but that's the beginning of our job costing overview, and that would show us all the income and any expenses. Now, another nice thing about this, Tim, is this isn't part of your questions, but I'll address it. What if we have to go service it? So we're leasing somebody this chiller. Great. 6 months from now, they call us. It's not working. You guys need to come fix it. And we're not going to be able to charge them for it, right? Maybe we are, maybe we're not, but let's pretend like we're not. So we would go out there and fix it, but we'll create an invoice for the repair. And then we will discount that down to zero using a discount item that we might call discount covered under lease. But what that'll do, Tim, is it'll add to the job costing report the payroll and the cost of goods sold, and even some overhead if you wanted to. It'll add all that to the job costing report. So now in 3 years, you could run the job costing report and really have a good idea of what this thing cost you. You have all the money coming in and all the money going out in one report. And by the way, you could do the depreciation at the end of the year. You don't have to do it monthly. You could create an adjusting journal entry and move money for depreciation at the end of the year if that worked. But it certainly could be monthly.
And let me ask you a question. In the customer's history, on the customer's equipment, since it's a rental equipment, does that still go under the customer's equipment and does it fall off? Or do you have to go back and remove it from the customer's equipment list?
Yes, it does. Well, no, it will not be part of the customer's equipment list because they don't own it.
Okay.
So it won't be customer equipment. And for those watching the video and aren't sure what we're talking about, under customers, we have a whole list of their equipment. Furnaces, air conditioners, condensing units, etc. It won't be here because it doesn't belong to them. It'll be in our asset list because it's an asset on our balance sheet. We own it. Now, it will get reassigned eventually to somebody else. If you come into the asset and you look at the assignments tab, you'll eventually see it reassigned to somebody else, which could be us. It's back to us. We still own it. We've always owned it, but now it's reassigned to us until we lease it out to somebody else or we do away with it.
Okay. Do we have an option? So if we're going back and doing some work on that equipment, right? So we're doing some work on there. Do we have an option to select from your work order that piece of equipment since it's not on the customer's equipment list? How do we show that we are working on that piece of equipment?
Well, if you have set up a job for that lease, then it'll be apparent. So that's another advantage to setting up the job.
A job, yeah.
Right. Now, by the way, there's nothing stopping someone from making this customer equipment also. And if somebody out there thought that would be appropriate for them, they could, because it will not affect their financials. It won't affect their balance sheet. If you create a customer piece of equipment, you don't have to explain where it came from to the software. It's happy with that. But generally, you wouldn't need to.
Okay. Makes sense.
All right. One question is, show how these invoices are billed in advance of return of the equipment. And I think we covered that. So we don't have the equipment back yet, but we've covered how to create the invoices, how to memorize them, how to generate those automatically. We didn't talk about it, but we certainly would want to create filters to make it easy to go find our lease invoices. Then, as I mentioned, we have the ability to batch print, batch email, batch credit card process. Another question was show how an equipment rental contract is set up to invoice these on a weekly, monthly basis. And I think we covered that. We did monthly, but we could have done weekly.
Yes, we did.
And then what about the contract? Because the questions that I have in front of me said rental agreement contract. What about the actual fine print? How do we set that up? Now, probably what we would want to do is create an invoice and then also have a boilerplate contract. And that boilerplate contract could either be pre-printed and included with the invoice, or it could be printed on the back of the invoice. You could create a custom invoice because, of course, we have the ability to create custom invoices. And I'll just do that for the sake of the recording here. We could go in and modify this invoice by putting terms and conditions in it. We could also make a page 2 full of terms and conditions. We could also use our product called Form Builder for the mobile device. So the mobile device could print out a contract and automatically merge customer information, asset information, et cetera, into the contract. So there's some different options. Any questions on what we covered?
No.
Okay. All right. I think I pretty well covered everything I could think of in addition to the questions, extra things that might come up in conversation. I think we have it pretty well covered as far as leasing things to companies. We didn't talk about the ability to take pictures. You certainly would want to take pictures of the equipment delivered, set in place. You can easily associate those pictures with the invoice, the asset. You can do that in mobile. That's about all I can think of. I think that's covered. The accounting side's covered pretty well. All right. So I think that covers our Q&A on how to set up an asset to lease and how to get that leased out to a customer